Welcome to the Claus YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Claus YouTube channel Strategic Frontlines. Today we have with us a very special guest, Miss Cleo Paskal. She is a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. She has also lectured at defense colleges in India, United States, and Oman. Welcome, Cleo, to this podcast.
A great pleasure. I'm a big fan of Claus's work, and your team is extraordinary and has been fighting some of the toughest fights of the century.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And today what we are going to do is we'll be discussing a very different subject, and that is the Pacific Islands. We know that along with US, Australia, New Zealand, and China, India has also started interacting with some of the island nations. So for the convenience of our viewers, I would first like to show the map of Pacific Island.
Good, great. Yeah.
See, this is the map of the Pacific Island. And if we go to the next slide, these are the 14 countries which are there. And go to the next slide. We can see that the Pacific Island is generally divided into three main ethnographic regions. First is the Melanesia. It's also known as the Black Island. And it has Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. And the second one is Micronesia, as the name itself suggests. It's made up of very small islands, and it has Kiribati, Nauru, Palau, federal state of Micronesia, and then comes the Polynesia, which means many islands, and it is the largest region, which has Hawaii, Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, Cook Islands, and Niue. Please go to the next slide. There are some Pacific islands where the territories are dependencies of nations, and primarily they are the United Nations, France, and New Zealand. So after knowing all these things, I would like to ask you, Cleo, what are the major challenges these nations are facing, which are generally common to all of them?
So first, thank you very much for the introduction. As you, I'll just go back to some of the maps because
Okay.
you saw, you could see the exclusive economic zones for a lot of the countries, and it's worth pointing out that under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, every island can get up to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around it.
Yes.
So you have, in many cases, places that don't have a lot of land, but they have a lot of ocean territory. So they tend to call themselves not small island states, but large ocean states. So a country like Kiribati, for example, has very small landmass aggregate, a lot of different islands, about 100,000 people, but it covers, its exclusive economic zone covers about as much of the Pacific as India does. As the continent, as the subcontinent of India is. I mean, that's how big their exclusive economic zone is. So in terms of commonalities, that means that they are covering large economic and strategic space with relatively limited resources. But it's also worth bearing in mind how different they are. So if you look at somewhere like Papua New Guinea, Papua New Guinea has a larger population and a larger landmass than New Zealand, and it's much more strategically located. So what you tend to get looking at the region is it's one of those regions where the colonial pair of glasses is still very much in play. Yeah, if you go back to the map part, yeah. So you look at Papua New Guinea, which is directly above Australia, has enormous resources, large population, highly strategically located, but we think about New Zealand before we think about Papua New Guinea from a strategic perspective. And part of that goes back to the post-Cold War structure and the colonial ties and New Zealand being part of the Five Eyes and all that stuff. So it's worth bearing in mind what they were as countries, what they are now, and what their potential is. And I think that when Prime Minister Modi visited Papua New Guinea, um, uh, there was a Pacific leaders meeting there, and he attended. And the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea showed respect by bending down to touch his feet. I'm sure a lot of people saw that photo, and it was he was well advised, but it was heartfelt. He wanted to show that emotion. So because many of them are caught, like many other countries around the world, between um, in their cases, the expression, in case of Papua New Guinea, primary expression of Western uh, uh, outlook for them is Australia. So they're caught between that kind of Australian outlook and what's coming down from China. And
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned China, so
Yeah.
let me bring in a little bit of geopolitics into it.
Yeah.
We know that China's presence is expanding, and it is through a combination of both economic reach as well as the security perspective.
Yes.
If we see the economic reach, we find that BRI is there. So through Belt and Road Initiative, it is trying to build a lot of countries' infrastructure. And as far as the security initiative is concerned, we find that, for example, if we take a classic examples of Solomon Island, so Chinese police and military presence is there, which is kind of very strange. So, what do you think is the implication of all these for Solomon Island themselves, as well as for other nation in that area?
Yeah. So this is something that India knows very well by what China is trying to do in the Indian Ocean. I mean, it's the same thing you would see in the Maldives or you'd see in Sri Lanka. It's a kind of sino-forming. It's trying to reshape a society into like a mini and compliant version of the way the Chinese Communist Party operates within China. So it's very socially and economically destructive. I think of the BRI as standing for the Bribery and Repression Initiative. That's what the BRI is to me.
new connotation I'm hearing.
Yeah, because that's basically what the infrastructure is almost secondary to reshaping the way a country does business through bribery and repression. And sometimes the infrastructure is very helpful, and in many cases, it really has been a failure of the West and other partners to deliver what the people of the country need. And so it's very attractive. But the Chinese investment comes with almost always three elements. The front facing is commercial. You need this for economic development, and they do. The second is strategic. We, China, want it for our strategic advantage. But there's always this third element, which is criminal activity. So if they're building a port, for example, the country needs the port. China builds the port with specifications that are useful for the PLA Navy, but usually they've also bought off customs officers, immigration officers. You start to see the drugs flowing in. You start to see that sort of stuff, and that's what's actually for the people of the Pacific. That third element is the biggest problem. It's the drugs destroy families, prostitution. Their institutions, government institutions, become more corrupt, and it becomes very difficult to come back from that.
Actually, I fully agree with you, because Chinese are known to give loans, and then the nation is unable to repay the loans, and that circle keeps on going. And slowly, these are the creeping encroachments what they have been doing. And what you rightly pointed out, considering the security mechanism of these nations may not be that great, they may not be having ample number of policemen and other paramilitary forces. to control these things. And you rightly pointed out, drugs and corruption and criminal activities is a big challenge, and it makes your society internally very weak.
Yeah.
So I really agree with you. So, but
And
I
if
want to
I may just quickly, because this is, and as the society starts to disintegrate, so that there's this Chinese strategic concept of disintegration warfare. I think of it as entropic warfare, where you deliberately try to create a chaos within the target society to weaken its institutions and to weaken its resistance to Chinese influence operations. That's a known strategy used by China, and then what happens is you get this justification, like they used in the Solomon Islands, for the policing, right? Your society is falling apart, you're having a riot, so we're going to send you police. But Chinese police are not police. They're state security operatives, right? They're
yes,
not helping you find your stolen bicycle. They're
yes.
a tool of repression of the state. So I try to personally be careful to make that distinction. China is not helping with policing. They're helping with repression on behalf of their client government. That's who they're sending.
You brought out a very valid point, because what they are trying to do is, by giving money, they're weakening the institutions, because the corruption is getting rampant, and then obviously this society itself is becoming more and more delicate from inside. So what you rightly pointed out is quite correct. Even if they have their police, they are not going to look into the social impact, what is there for that country. They'll be doing what the objective of their statecraft tells them to do. So
Yeah.
you had a very valid point in that. But here I would like to ask you, we know that United States and its allies are also responding to re-engage with this region. So how are they trying to re-engage? And if you can also throw some light on the grouping which is known as the Partners in the Blue Pacific, if you can also talk
Okay,
about
yeah.
that.
So from my perspective, and I've written about this, I'm very clear about this. I think that there are from a U.S. strategic perspective, there are three different priority areas, 3.5 really, three different priority areas, and they require three different strategies. The first priority areas, there's a lot of the Pacific that are America. So you mentioned Hawaii, for example, but Guam, Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. I mean, these are places. Guam is an 8-hour flight west of Hawaii. You get on a plane in Hawaii, you fly 8 hours, and you land in west, and you land in America in Guam, and it's only 4 hours from Seoul or Taipei, or Tokyo. I mean that it's that far west. That is the United States. So that's one area of primary. And the Chinese influence operations in places like Saipan are very, very high, very high. So that's one. The second area is there are three countries across the middle of the Pacific: Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, where the U.S. has what's called a Compact of Free Association, which allows strategic denial. And it allows the U.S. a certain degree of basing. The people, they're independent countries, but the people of those countries can freely live and work in the U.S. That's the secondary. The third is kind of this rest of the Pacific that's like Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, which is not as strategically critical to the U.S., but is and so the U.S. has kind of, especially since the end of the Cold War, had delegated strategic responsibility to Australia and New Zealand. So when you're in India and you talk about the Pacific Islands, people are actually mostly talking about this southern Pacific part and looking at it from an Australia to New Zealand perspective. So, and I think that Australia has completely messed up, and
Yeah.
and in multiple different ways, and I'm very concerned. And they're kind of countering China in China's way. So if you look at the Solomon Islands, China says we're going to give you police and whatever, and Australia says no, we'll give you police, and we'll give you
Yes.
$140 million for your policing without cleaning up the corruption and without so all they're doing is subsidizing a government that is fully pro-China and isn't reflective of the will of the people. So they're building up this state security institution, but not the hospitals. So I have friends in one of the provinces, and I got a message from him recently. One of the friends saying, "We have no food in our hospital. We are yeah. I mean, they already had no very difficult time getting medicine, right? It's at that level. Somebody I know's wife is very sick, and she's been waiting for surgery for over a year because they just don't have the medicine to do the surgery. And now they have no food in the hospital. And then they hear Australia is about to is giving them over $100 million for policing.
Yes.
They're saying we can police ourselves. We're not all criminals. I don't know,
Yes.
but what we need is.
I think the Australians should not go into the trap what Chinese are creating. There are a lot of other areas where you need to cooperate, because what China is doing, in order to counter their activities, you need to have something in the social sector where you give, like you rightly pointed out, you give medicines and things which are required, because that is the way you build goodwill of the people. And it would be easier for Australia and New Zealand, because of the proximity with these islands, to do those kind of things. In fact, they can do a lot, because China still is pretty far off. For it to come and do it, it's challenging. But what are your views about New Zealand? How do you feel New Zealand is approaching them?
Yeah, so New Zealand is New Zealand. So the basic question is, what's the problem? I mean, and so from my perspective, you have to do two things at the same time. You have to block the Chinese. Now, the Philippines has a term for it, which I like very much, which is ICAD: illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. So that's the acronym ICAD. The Chinese: illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive activity. You have to block that while you're doing what you're talking about, building all those social programs, because from a Chinese perspective, anything that makes the society stronger is a threat to China's strategy for the region. So they will try to undermine it. They'll try to, if you try to build a hospital, then their person in the government might slow down the environmental permits, or you might have problems with getting trucks to do the rebuilding, or they unless they're delivering it, it's a threat to them, and they benefit from chaos and insecurity within the society. So you need to be able to stand up and defend against the Chinese activity, block that activity while building. And both Australia and New Zealand have the same fundamental problem, which is that they've decided to tie their economies substantially to China. So, are they willing? And China doesn't compartmentalize. So, if New Zealand causes it problems in the Cook Islands, it will say, we're going to stop your imports, New Zealand, right? And is New Zealand going to have the backbone to sacrifice some of its own economic interests? And it's a democracy, so that means that it could affect those politicians at the ballot box for the sake of defending this other country that doesn't bring them economic benefit, that doesn't vote in their elections. I mean, Cook Islands is a bit of a different case, but so there's that question, and part of it is they may be willing to do it, and the Australians have stood up in other cases, and New Zealand's too, some cases, but they haven't had that discussion. They're not willing to say, No, China is acting in an illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive way. The money you talked about, Solomon Islands and corruption, or I did, that a lot of that corruption, the Chinese will give them the money, but they don't want to spend the money in Solomons. They want to spend it in Australian real estate or New Zealand bank accounts. And their Australia and New Zealand is not going after any of that illegal money that's being laundered through their systems. So what signal are they sending?
Yes. No, you rightly pointed out, because there has to be some system where the economies are helped. And, you rightly pointed out that India's Prime Minister also visited these islands. And India is also trying to play a significant role in the Pacific Islands because it is a broader policy of our Indo-Pacific strategy. And we have created what is known as Indo-Pacific Island Cooperation. And we are trying to develop we have a lot of development programs, especially for capacity building. And for example, maritime domain awareness. We are also working through the Voice of Global South by addressing the concerns of small island developing states. And as you rightly pointed out, Indian diaspora in some of the Pacific Islands is also very important to us, where culturally we can do a lot. And Fiji is a classic example. So what, in your terms, India can do bilaterally or multilaterally for these countries? Say, example, India-Japan. Do you feel India-Japan can do a lot for these countries?
I do. I think that from India, I would encourage India to do what it's very good at, which is taking off those colonial glasses and actually just looking at the region for its own, in a bilateral way, and the region is very used to being direct about strategic interests, and India's priority strategic areas are going to be the areas that are the most likely to be involved in anything related to Taiwan. Now, there are 3 countries that recognize Taiwan in the area, which means that they don't have that. They have a very different sort of attack, let's say, from China, and they could definitely use with support for their position, and that just shows a sort of a willingness to engage with other democracies. But the first instinct when you look at the area is to go, well, what about Australia, New Zealand? And we've just talked about the problems. You don't want to carry their colonial baggage, frankly.
Yes.
Okay? And
yes.
And also that strategic area, it's important, and there are those ties to places like Fiji, but from looking at a strategic map perspective, it's actually the Central Pacific that's the most strategically important, and the allies there that India has very good and unique relationships with are, for example, Japan. Japan actually, under the League of Nations from 1914 to 1944. That area of Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia was all under Japan. So the people alive today, their parents would have spoken Japanese. There's those ties,
Yes.
and it wasn't like Manchuria. It was a colonial experiment as opposed to kind of an invasion and occupation. A very different history. And Japan has worked very hard to rehabilitate its relationship with Pacific Islands, and they're very well respected development, and they do a lot of infrastructure.
Yes.
But for language reasons and just cultural reasons, they don't do the soft side. So Japan can build a hospital, but then it goes, right?
I think it would be nice if India and Japan both work together in those areas, because India can do a lot in soft power. For example, culturally, a lot of affiliation can be there in certain islands. And Japan has a very nice way of helping countries, because it's very open, firstly, and it goes in for the core areas of development. So that's also nice. India also, in the similar way, goes for the core areas like building hospitals and things like that, and a very open, what you call it, system. It's very transparency is there in both the nations' approach to building capacity building in these kind of nations.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and India can follow up with the medical training with the human side, right, and the pharmaceuticals and and a lot of that was in what Prime Minister Modi proposed. The 12 points or steps that he proposed in Port Moresby, but it's been difficult to deliver it because India doesn't have a very big diplomatic footprint. So if it was, working with Japan, for example, to help deliver, through Japan has very wide representation across the Pacific, then that could, and another country that, especially in the Central Pacific, that in the maritime domain or others, is the Philippines. The Philippines is sort of the unacknowledged large Pacific Island country. It has a lot of the same issues, geography, and it is adjacent. It shares a maritime boundary with Palau, for example, and there are Filipinos across that whole area. So as India is developing its relationships with some of these other countries, it can learn. I would recommend learning from them how they can work together to help rebuild. And if you're dealing with a country like Philippines, it has already proven it will stand up to China. I mean, more than I have huge respect for the Philippines, what they've done, and also just in thinking about ICAD, illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. They're very clear. And the people of the Pacific, I think, view them much more as neighbors and as part of the community, and will listen to them more than they would listen to somebody from Australia, for example.
I see.
Yeah.
So I think what the takeaway, what I feel is India can have a bilateral relationship with Japan and Philippines as to chart out a plan and how to go about helping these nations. And what you rightly pointed out, medical help is one area where we can do wonders, and also capacity building. For example, building hospitals, that's also another area. Training is another area which we can do. Apart from that, also HADR is another area. So do you feel as far as bilaterally we can work, and also will a multilateral approach like India, Australia, New Zealand coming together and working together, will that also work? Well, or it is difficult concept.
Well, first of all, the ideal is bilateral between India and a country itself.
Japan.
No, the Pacific Island countries themselves. I mean, that's just obviously
that's
ideal.
The best way.
That's the best.
That's the best way.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and then, if you're working with other partners, it depends on geographically. The Australians are extremely jealous of their position in the region, and there have been cases where, for example, Papua New Guinea wanted a defense relationship with the U.S. directly, and openly said, we don't want the Australians, we want it direct with the U.S. And the Australians didn't like it, and tried to create some problems, and then ended up signing their own bilateral deal with Papua New Guinea. So if you come in, you can expect that Australia would expect to be part of it.
I think Australia thinks that it is their area of influence, so probably they are more comfortable dealing with them directly. And I think for us also, dealing directly with the islands is the most convenient and important thing to do.
It's the most respectful and the most sustainable.
Yes, it's more sustainable, absolutely. But I feel US is also trying to do a lot. They have increased the donations and diplomatic engagements with these countries also. So how do you feel about it? Is it enough, or they need to do much more?
So the U.S. is a work in progress at the moment. So some projects some things were cut because of USAID, but now some things are coming back. Like they've just within the last week or so re-announced that the funding that was on hold for the tuna treaty has now been put back in. So things are evolving, but what we do know, of course, obviously, is that the U.S. is very keen on burden sharing. And so, Indian engagement that helps on these files, I think, would be positively seen. And again, there's kind of different strategic priorities for the U.S. So there's, that the parts that are the U.S. and those are areas like the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, which is where Saipan is. The Chinese influence is extremely high. So it's the only place in the U.S. where Chinese can arrive without a visa. So there's a place in the U.S. Chinese can arrive without a visa, and the argument is we need it for tourism. Well, maybe Indian tourists want to go to Saipan, right? And yeah, so there's, but. So there's that, but in other areas it might be maritime domain awareness or another. Or I prefer maritime domain enforcement as opposed to awareness. We know bad things are out there. Let's do something about it. But I think that finding ways of cooperating in different ways in different parts of the Pacific with the U.S. would definitely be welcome. And Secretary Hegseth, from Department of Defense, one of his first major foreign trips was he went to Hawaii, he went to Guam, he went to Philippines. So he visited the first, second, third island chain. So the awareness of the importance of the Pacific, including obviously the Pacific Islands, to U.S. strategic interests and hemispheric defense, it falls into hemispheric defense, is very high.
And what do you think about the French? How are French placed in that area?
So that's a good question, because if there's any young researcher or old researchers or any researchers who are listening, the area that I think requires a lot more research now is how the idea of sovereignty and what is a country is being played with in the Pacific. And that's coming to a head now in New Caledonia, which is a French colony, and the population is, not quite, but let's just say for argument's sake, a little bit around half indigenous, and the other half is not. There's a percentage that's white. There's a percentage that's French, but from Algerian descent. There are a lot of Polynesians. So there's a kind of mixture. And there were very bad riots. People died, and a lot of people left. And that changed the demographics. And if there was a referendum today, it's very possible that it could vote for independence. And there is a push, and the hardcore pro-independentists are being backed by places like Azerbaijan, because the Azerbaijanis are mad at the French for backing Armenia and are backing these anti-French colonial movements all across. But some of the language that was put forward there was an agreement that looks like it may have fallen apart now, that would have created a state within a state. It uses words around nationhood and self-determination that could open the door for quite a few other French possessions to move towards independence. So those of us who've been looking at France for a while thought, the French will never give them up. You know what the French are like, they love giving them up. But it actually looks like the French are looking for a way out. And this affects the Indian Ocean as well. And I think the French have a lot of domestic problems. They don't have a lot of economic problems. There are problems in Europe generally, and we may be seeing the beginning of the end of that global French footprint, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm just not sure. That's why it's a very good question to ask.
Okay. So we had a very good podcast. So would you mind if I take few questions?
Oh, please. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is from Mr. Akash Tadani. He wants to ask, as soon as the Chinese understand that the Americans have taken them for a long ride over the decades, they would find reason to mend their fence with Bharat, your views. I mean,
So I think I think that the Chinese have taken the Americans for a long ride over the decades.
I know
You
the
know,
way
they
things are going
yeah,
with Trump also. If you see the Chinese, they have certain leverages with Trump also, because the kind of tariffs he's putting on us, he's not doing the same with China.
yeah. So I really don't that. It's inexplicable to me. But I think the core of the question um, is India-China relations, and I defer to you. You know that better than I ever will. From what I've seen from the Chinese, they will make it look. They'll tell you what you want to hear, but they want. They're not going to give up Arunachal Pradesh. I mean, they're what they are. Anyway, sorry.
There's another question. What more can India and Australia do to counter Chinese influence in this region?
So what you can do depends on your toolkit. And remember, I talked about block and build. Okay. So the Australians can do a lot more to block. They can help go after the corruption that's being laundered through Australia, New Zealand. India is much more of a builder. It's much more of a reinforcement. But Doctor, I was wondering, because you have a lot more experience looking at successfully doing this in the Indian Ocean. So what do you think India could do? What do you think?
I think you need to have a very sound Indo-Pacific policy, what we already have, and we have a lot of multilateral engagements. What we have trilateral engagements, like we have with Sri Lanka, Maldives. So I think we need to increase our reach in these areas also. And I think what we have had that forum of Pacific Island. That's a very good forum.
Yes.
And through that we can do a lot, but it's a process. It takes time because we entered in this area a little late, so it'll take little time for us. And what you rightly pointed out, our reach is little lesser as far as diplomatic initiatives are concerned, because we don't have that many uh, diplomatic personnel in each and every part of the area. So it takes time to build up those and to have those things. But considering that we have started looking into these areas and our Prime Minister visited, that shows that we have started the process.
Yes.
And we will definitely try to build on it, and slowly we are going to work on that area, whether it is the capacity building or it is HADR or maritime domain awareness. These are the three basic things. And because especially as far as HADR is concerned, being in Indo-Pacific area, we are the major what you call it, nations which can help people in this area. And especially for Maldives, we had done a lot, and we were the first responders as far as HADR is concerned.
Yeah.
But when I spoke to you, I realized that there are a lot of issues as far as infrastructure is concerned and the training is concerned in these Pacific Islands. So training is one area where India is very strong. So that training can be done, whether it is the police or the hospital staff or the nursing or the medical is there. Education is there. Institution building is there. There are so many other things which we can do, which we can combine. So the cooperation is endless. You just have to have certain parameters fixed with other countries or individually, bilaterally talking to these people what they want and what we can provide. That's the best way I feel to go along.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and also just in terms of infrastructure, because it just sorry, back to the questions, but just India builds infrastructure, and it builds infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be aid. And the Indian business knows how to operate in difficult
Yes.
village economic scale things. Like that's
Yes.
they want to be normal countries with economic development and
Absolutely.
economic trade, and so yeah, but there'll be attempts to block that. The Chinese will try to block that. So that's where, if you don't get rid of the corruption, which is something Australia could help with if it wanted,
Yes.
then you level the playing field, and then I think it would be a lot easier for.
The other
Sorry.
area which Akashika wants to ask is, beyond defense, what role do culture, education, and people to people has ties play to countering Chinese influence? I think this is a very important and very valid question,
It is.
especially if you have cultural ties with these countries. As you pointed out, it can play a very positive role as far as negating any influence is concerned. Your views?
Yeah, I would, and I would expand it to, I mean, not not just Chinese influence. There have been some very odd things coming out of the West lately, also. So just in terms of strengthening society. So no matter what comes at it, and yet it's all the usual stuff. Obviously, people tend to like the movies and things like that because they're very family-based societies, and in many cases actually quite conservative. So having a movie that you can watch with the family and not worry about something embarrassing happening during the movie, things like that, it reflects well, and I think in part because the climates tend to be, especially southern India, tend to be similar. What's available food-wise can be so, but the Indian cooking is very well received. So just those sorts of things that make people feel comfortable.
More comfortable. Yes, absolutely.
And the people, what I would also encourage is the people I know from, for example, I know 3 people from Tonga who've done their master's degree in India and in geopolitics or political issues. And they found, first of all, they loved India, and they felt very at home very quickly, but also they found the strategic culture of India much more reflective of their reality. So they kind of had to figure out how to work in a complex environment. You're not the West. You're not China. You've worked through it in a very different way. So engagement with the strategic community, with helping them to build up think tanks, with bringing over strategy. We tend to go to the military colleges, but the strategic engagement is also very helpful. We saw this at the G20, right, where there was just when India hosted the G20, a real excitement in a lot of the world. Oh, there's another option. So yeah, I think that India is very welcome. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I think India is speaking about the global south, and that also makes a little bit of connection with other countries also. We'll take one last question, and I think it's very pertinent. How do Pacific Island countries balance the immediate development needs with the long-term risk of over-reliance on external powers?
Yeah,
I think that's happening in some part, like Solomon Islands and others.
Yeah. So it's a very good question, and it gets to being able to discuss, when you talk about a country like Solomon Islands, who are you really talking about? And we tend to defer to the government in power. But if you're dealing with a system where corruption is already highly advanced, the government in power may not reflect the people, and the government in power may not actually be wanting to look towards their long-term development. They might be looking towards their personal short-term development of the people in power, right? So I'm going to use this question just as a way of disaggregating. So when the concept of a decision made by a country. You really need to understand who is actually making that decision. And if you're a democracy and you care about democracy, whether that's reflective of the will of the people, so that you don't say, oh, that country is, Solomon Islands is pro-China. Well, the majority of the population of the last election didn't vote for candidates who wanted a closer relationship with China. But who they voted in ended up getting co-opted, possibly through corruption, into a pro-Chinese position. So that's why sometimes working at the subnational level, working with the states makes a lot more sense, or working with community groups makes a lot more sense, because the closer you get to the ground, the more you're going to find people in that sort of a situation who do have a longer term view, and a realistic longer term view, and who are trying to build their communities from the ground up. It's the counter to the disintegration warfare. If China's trying to disintegrate those institutions of state, you need to reintegrate from the bottom up to create something viable over the long term.
Thank you so much, Cleo. We really try to understand what are the challenges, what these Pacific Island countries are facing, and hopefully we have found some way how to negotiate that and how to move forward. And thank you so much for your time and this podcast. And I thank all my viewers also. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.